They would later call her the Ghost, a name whispered in the hushed debriefings and after-action reports that tried and failed to quantify the events that transpired 2,000 feet beneath the granite teeth of the Zagros Mountains. Before the mountain itself began to scream, she was merely Eris Thorne, a civilian analyst with a penchant for silence and an unsettling stillness. Before Major Coulson learned the true weight of his rank and found it wanting, she was just an anomaly, a quiet woman in the corner of his command center who watched the data streams with the unblinking focus of a predator. And before he and two of his hand-picked men cornered her in the sterile, echoing confines of a lavatory, she was a problem he believed he could solve with the blunt instrument of his authority. In this, as in all other things that day, he was catastrophically wrong. She walked out alone, her steps measured and silent on the polished concrete, leaving behind the wreckage of his pride and the beginning of a legend. The air in Deep Listening Post 7, officially designated DLP-7, but known colloquially as the Needle, was a carefully engineered cocktail of recycled oxygen, nitrogen, and the faint, metallic tang of overworked server racks. It was stale, thin, and carried the constant subliminal hum of 100 different systems working in concert to keep the 150 souls inside it alive. The Needle was a marvel of military engineering, a vertical shaft drilled nearly half a mile into the earth, culminating in a series of reinforced chambers that bristled with sensors, antennas, and quantum-entangled comms relays. Its purpose was singular: to listen. It listened to the tectonic sighs of the planet, the whisper of encrypted radio traffic bleeding through rock, and the subtle, telltale vibrations of illicit tunneling from the hostile nation just across the border. For the men and women stationed there, it was a tomb with a mission clock, a place of profound isolation where the sun was a rumor and the silence between status reports was a physical weight. Eris Thorne seemed uniquely suited to this environment. She occupied a small, shadowed alcove in the primary command center, a space most personnel avoided. Her workstation was a triptych of monolithic screens that displayed not troop movements or satellite imagery, but cascading waves of raw geological and acoustic data. They were esoteric, chaotic things to the untrained eye. Seismographic squiggles, Fourier transforms of ambient noise, and spectrographic analyses of deep earth resonance. To Eris, they formed a language. She read the subtle shifts in the planet's crust the way a poet reads verse, discerning meaning in the minutiae, finding patterns in the noise that the station's own sophisticated algorithms dismissed as statistical ghosts. She had been here for 3 months, a civilian attachment from the Geological Survey Directorate, a title so blandly bureaucratic it invited no further questions. Her presence was a quiet one. She spoke only when necessary, her voice a low, even monotone that conveyed information without inflection. Her movements were economical, her posture unchanging for hours at a time as she sat before her screens, her focus absolute. She was a ghost long before she earned the name. Major Roman Coulson, United States Marine Corps, was the antithesis of a ghost. He was a creature of noise, presence, and protocol. His voice was a blunt instrument used to carve his authority into the day. His boots struck the grated metal floors of the Needle with a percussive certainty that announced his arrival long before he entered a room. He was the commander of the Marine Security Detachment, the de facto king of this subterranean castle, and he ruled it with an unyielding belief in the sanctity of the chain of command. He was a man built of sharp angles and rigid doctrine, his worldview forged in the deserts of Anbar and the mountains of Kunar. He understood threats he could see, enemies he could shoot, and orders he could shout. He did not understand the quiet woman in the corner. He saw her as a disruption, a civilian whose very presence was a challenge to the rigid military hierarchy that was, to him, the only thing separating order from chaos. Her reports, when she filed them, were dense with incomprehensible jargon about lithospheric stress and anomalous resonant frequencies. They were flagged by his executive officer as low-priority academic nonsense. Coulson agreed. The real threats came from the surface, from spies and special forces teams who might try to assault the bunker's hardened steel entrance. His men trained for this eventuality with brutal efficiency. They ran drills in the narrow corridors, practiced close-quarters combat until their knuckles were raw, and maintained their weapons with religious devotion. They were preparing for a fight they could understand. Eris Thorne watched them sometimes, her gaze distant, her expression unreadable behind the faint glare of her monitors. Her analysis of the needle's security posture was clinical and damning. They were preparing for a frontal assault, a siege. It was a strategy as old as castles, but the needle wasn't a castle. It was an eggshell suspended in a medium that was growing increasingly unstable. Coulson was polishing the shell while the yolk within was beginning to curdle. She saw the signs in the data, subtle at first, then more insistent, a persistent, low-frequency hum that had no natural origin. A pattern of microfractures developing in the granite strata far above them, forming a latticework of weakness. The mountain was being tuned, like a vast stone instrument, and she suspected they were approaching the crescendo. Her attempts to communicate this were met with a wall of procedural dismissal. She submitted her findings through official channels. Her report, titled Analysis of Artificially Induced Stratigraphic Instability, was kicked back by Coulson's office with a note scribbled in the margin. Translate to plain English. Focus on actionable intelligence. He wanted to know about troop movements, not rock mechanics. He wanted a target he could point a rifle at, not a theory about weaponized geology. To him, her warnings were the academic ramblings of a scientist who didn't understand the realities of warfare. He saw her quiet persistence as insubordination, her specialized knowledge as willful obscurity. The friction between them grew from a low hum to a grating buzz that filled the command center. The confrontation, when it came, was not in the tactical operations center under the unblinking eyes of surveillance cameras, but in a place far more personal and confined. It was a calculated move by Coulson, designed to strip her of the context of her work, to isolate her from the glowing screens that were her shield and her pulpit. He wanted to remind her that in the physical world, the world of muscle and bone and rank, he was the authority. She had left her station to use the lavatory, one of the few places in the facility not under constant audio-visual surveillance. The room was small, clinical, and stark. White tile, stainless steel, the hum of the ventilation louder here than anywhere else. The silence after the heavy door, hissed shut, was a brief, welcome respite. She stood before the mirror, not looking at her reflection. A woman of average height, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to absorb the light. But at the subtle vibration she could feel through the soles of her shoes. It was there again. The hum, faint but growing in amplitude. A pure, unnatural tone that the rock around them was beginning to learn. The door hissed open again. Major Coulson filled the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking most of the light from the corridor. Behind him stood two of his senior NCOs, Gunnery Sergeant Miller and Staff Sergeant Rivas. They were large men, products of the relentless physical conditioning of the Marine Corps, their expressions impassive and loyal. They stepped inside, and the door hissed shut behind them, sealing the four of them in the small, tiled space. The air became thick, charged with intent. "Dr. Thorne," Coulson began, his voice a low growl that was somehow more menacing than his usual parade ground bark. He had never used her title before. Now he wielded it like a weapon, a reminder of her civilian, other status. "We need to have a talk, off the record." Aris turned from the sink slowly. Her posture didn't change. Her heart rate, she noted with detached clinical interest, remained a steady 62 beats per minute. Her breathing was slow and even. She performed a rapid threat assessment. Coulson, in the center, was the primary. Emotional, overconfident, likely to overcommit. Miller, on her left, was the muscle. Tense, coiled, watching her hands. Rivas, on her right, was the wild card. He seemed less certain, his eyes flicking towards the door. The space was tight, 3 meters by 4, hard surfaces everywhere. A weaponized environment, if one knew how to use it. "Major," she replied, her voice betraying nothing. It was a simple statement of his rank, an acknowledgement, not a concession. "I'm tired of your games, Thorne," Coulson said, taking a step forward. The two NCOs shifted, subtly flanking her, cutting off any path to the door. It was a classic intimidation tactic. Boxing a target. "I'm tired of your cryptic reports and your attitude. You're a civilian on my base, and you seem to have forgotten that. I want to know who you really are, who you work for, and you're going to tell me right now." Her mind worked with the cool, frictionless speed of a quantum computer. She calculated vectors, strike points, probable reactions. She analyzed their stances, the distribution of their weight, the slight tremor in Coulson's hand that betrayed the adrenaline surging through his system. He was operating on ego and anger. They were operating on orders. All of them were making a mistake. She had given them the data. She had provided the analysis. The failure was theirs, a failure of imagination and intellect. This escalation was the last resort of a man who had run out of ideas. "My reports are clear," she stated, her gaze fixed on a point just over Coulson's shoulder. "The threat is geological. The protocols you are running are insufficient." Coulson laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the tile. "The threat is me, right now, telling you that you are relieved of your duties. Your network access is terminated. You will be confined to your quarters until you can be escorted off this installation. Now, for the last time, who is your handler?" He took another step, invading her personal space. He was close enough now that she could smell the coffee on his breath, see the burst capillaries in his eyes. This was the precipice. He was forcing a physical confrontation. She had hoped to avoid it. It was inefficient, messy, but necessary. The system had failed. The hierarchy had broken down. To save them, she first had to remove the obstruction. "You are making a serious error, Major," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. It was her final warning, a professional courtesy. He reached for her arm. Now. The movement was a blur of pure economy. It wasn't about strength. It was about physics. As his fingers brushed her sleeve, her left hand shot up, not to block, but to guide. Her fingers, precisely placed, found the radial nerve on his wrist. She applied minimal pressure. A jolt, like a powerful electric shock, shot up his arm. His hand spasmed open, his face contorting in a mask of shocked pain. He stumbled back a step, clutching his arm, incomprehension warring with agony in his eyes. Miller, the gunnery sergeant, reacted on instinct, lunging forward to grab her. He was faster than Coulson, more practiced, but he was still predictable. She didn't retreat. She flowed towards him, pivoting on the ball of her right foot. As he reached, she was no longer there. Her right hand, fingers stiffened into a blade, struck the side of his neck, precisely on the vagus nerve cluster. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his body went limp. He collapsed like a sack of laundry, his fall cushioned by the body of his commanding officer, who was still trying to process the fire in his own arm. Rivas, the staff sergeant, froze for a critical half-second. He was a soldier, not a brawler, and this was not in any training manual. He saw his two superiors neutralized in less time than it took to draw a breath by a woman half their size. His hand moved instinctively towards the sidearm holstered on his thigh. He never got there. Aris had already closed the distance. Her left foot stomped down, not on his foot, but on the delicate instep, shattering the small bones there with a sickening crunch. As he cried out and his body reflexively bent forward, her right knee came up in a brutal, efficient arc, connecting with his chin. The impact snapped his head back, and the lights went out. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious, before he even realized he'd been hit. It had taken less than 3 seconds. Aris stood in the center of the small room. The ventilation hummed. Rivas was unconscious. Miller was out cold, his breathing shallow. Coulson was on one knee, cradling his right arm, his face pale with shock and disbelief. He looked up at her, his authority stripped away, leaving only a raw, terrified confusion. He saw nothing of the quiet analyst in her eyes. He saw something ancient and cold and utterly lethal. She looked down at him, her expression unchanged. There was no triumph, no anger, no satisfaction. There was only the quiet assessment of a task completed. "The obstruction has been cleared," she said, as if dictating a line in a report. "I am resuming my duties." She stepped over Rivas's legs, her movements precise and unhurried. The door hissed open, and she walked back out into the corridor, her footsteps making no sound. The door hissed shut behind her, sealing the major in with the quiet, tiled wreckage of his command. She walked out alone. The command center was a hive of controlled anxiety. The low-level hum Aris had been tracking was no longer subliminal. It had risen in pitch and volume, a tangible presence in the air. It vibrated through the floor plates, buzzed in the teeth. A coffee cup on a console rattled against its saucer in a frantic, tiny dance. Every screen that displayed a structural integrity reading was blinking yellow. The mood had shifted from routine boredom to a tense, simmering unease. Coulson's absence had been noted, but no one dared to question it. They had all seen Aris Thorne return to her station, her composure absolute, and sit down as if nothing had happened. They had seen the look on her face, and it had silenced all questions. She ignored the curious, fearful glances. Her fingers flew across her keyboard, her mind already light years beyond the squalid confrontation in the lavatory. That was a physical problem, now solved. This was an existential one. The data flooding her screens confirmed her worst fears. The resonance was achieving a cascade. The enemy wasn't tunneling. They weren't planning a frontal assault. They were using the mountain itself as a weapon. They were exciting the natural resonant frequency of the granite strata, slowly, methodically, shaking it apart from the inside out. The needle, with all its reinforced concrete and hardened steel, was nothing more than a pin stuck in a block of crumbling chalk. A loud groan echoed through the facility, a deep, guttural sound of rock under unbearable stress. Dust sifted down from the ceiling vents. A bank of lights flickered and died, plunging one corner of the room into shadow. Panic, sharp and acrid, began to snake through the air. "What the hell was that?" a young lieutenant shouted, his voice cracking. "Seismic event?" "Major Coulson, to the command center," someone else called into a comms unit. The only reply was static. The failure of orthodoxy began. The duty officer, a captain named Evans, fell back on his training. He initiated lockdown protocols. Heavy blast doors rumbled shut, sealing off the various sectors of the bunker. It was a textbook response to an internal breach or a chemical attack. It was utterly useless against a threat that was coming from every direction at once. He ordered his communications technicians to raise surface command to report a seismic anomaly. But the comms were failing. The intense vibrations were playing havoc with the delicate fiber optic lines, and the enemy's resonant field was generating enough electromagnetic interference to turn high-frequency radio into white noise. They were shouting into a hurricane. Another groan, louder this time. A hairline crack appeared in the thick plexiglass of the main observation window, which looked out onto the cavernous primary access shaft. It branched, forking like a bolt of black lightning. The men and women in the room stared at it, mesmerized by the slow, inevitable creep of their own destruction. Captain Evans was shouting orders, but they were reflexive, meaningless gestures. "Get damage control teams suited up. Check the integrity of the primary air scrubbers. Someone find the major." He was following a checklist for a fire on a ship, not the disintegration of a mountain. His rigid, by-the-book approach was a catastrophic failure of imagination. He was trying to patch a leak in a dam that was collapsing from its foundations. Eris watched this chaos with a cold, detached clarity. She saw the fear, the failed procedures, the breakdown of command. They were reacting, not thinking. They were trapped in a paradigm of warfare that was suddenly, violently obsolete. She ran the final calculations. Her models were stark. At the current rate of resonant amplification, catastrophic structural failure of the primary shaft was 17 minutes away. The entire facility would collapse into a tomb of crushed rock and twisted metal. There was no escape. There was no rescue. There was only one, infinitesimally small, chance. It was time. She stood up. The simple motion cut through the rising panic. In the midst of the noise and the fear, her stillness was a magnet for every eye in the room. She walked from her shadowed alcove into the center of the command deck, her steps measured and deliberate. The floor vibrated beneath her feet, a constant, jarring tremor. She stopped beside Captain Evans, who was still trying to get a coherent report from a frantic engineer. "Captain," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it had a quality of absolute focus that sliced through the noise. Evans turned, his face slick with sweat. "Thorne, what is it? Do you know what this is?" "I do," she said, "and your protocols are irrelevant. You are accelerating our demise." He stared at her, dumbfounded. "What? Who the hell do you think you are? Lockdown is standard procedure. Lockdown concentrates the structural stress on the central pylons," she cut in, her tone flat and clinical. "You have turned a resonant chamber into a compression chamber. You must open all internal blast doors and reroute primary power to the seismic dampener array. Now." The room fell silent, save for the groaning of the mountain. The crew looked from the frantic failing captain to the impossibly calm civilian analyst. It was a moment of crystalline decision. They could follow the man with the rank, whose orders were leading them further into disaster, or they could listen to the woman who spoke with the chilling certainty of someone who understood the physics of their doom. A young communications specialist, a sergeant named Reyes, was the first to break. He had seen her reports. He had seen the way she worked, the quiet intensity of her focus. He had also seen Major Coulson's dismissive notes. He made a choice. "Her analysis is correct, sir," Reyes said, his voice quiet but firm. "The harmonic resonance is being amplified by the sealed sections. We're ringing like a bell." Evans looked betrayed. "Sergeant, you will follow my—" "There's no time for this," Eris stated. It was not a suggestion. It was a declaration of a new reality. She moved past the stunned captain and sat down at the master command console, the station reserved for the facility commander. Her hands moved over the holographic interface, her fingers dancing through security protocols and command overrides that should have been impenetrable. A series of coded authentications, biometric signatures bypassed with strings of alphanumeric impossibilities, and command-level encryption keys that she seemed to pluck from the air. In less than 10 seconds, the screen flashed green. Command authority transferred. Captain Evans stared, his mouth agape. That's impossible. That requires a flag-level override from NORAD." Eris didn't look at him. "The situation has been reassessed," she said, her eyes locked on the console. A schematic of the entire facility appeared on the main screen. With a few swift gestures, she disengaged the lockdown. The thunderous sound of massive blast doors retracting echoed through the decks. A collective sigh of relief went through the room as a fraction of the structural pressure was released. The violent shuddering lessened, just slightly. Authority did not need to be seized. It flowed to her. The crew, seeing a tangible result, seeing the calm, decisive action in the face of their leadership's paralysis, turned to her as one. They were soldiers, sailors, and airmen. They were trained to follow orders, but more than that, they were trained to survive. And in that moment, Eris Thorne was the only person in the room who offered them a path to survival. "Reyes," she said, her voice crisp, "I need a full diagnostic on the primary power core. Give me real-time output levels and capacitor charge rates. Ignore the safeties." "Yes, ma'am," he replied instantly. The ma'am, instinctive, reflexive. He turned to his console, his fingers flying. "Engineering," she continued, her voice now broadcast over the facility-wide comm. "I am rerouting all non-essential power to the primary capacitor banks. Prepare for a full system discharge on my mark. The feedback may be significant." "Lieutenant," she said, turning to the young officer who had first panicked. He straightened up, his fear replaced by a desperate need for purpose. "Get me a direct feed from the outermost geophone sensors. I need raw, unfiltered acoustic data. I need to hear what the mountain is hearing." Orders flew from her, each one precise, logical, and counterintuitive to standard doctrine. She wasn't trying to save the facility. She was preparing to use it as a weapon. The crew, stripped of their broken protocols, moved with a newfound speed and efficiency. They had a mission. They had a commander. For the first time since the shaking began, the chaos in the command center receded, replaced by a tense, focused energy. Eris Thorne, the quiet analyst, the ghost in the machine, was now in complete control. The turn was complete. Now she had 12 minutes to save them all. Her plan was an act of supreme intellectual violence, a piece of strategic audacity that bordered on madness. They could not stop the enemy's resonant frequency weapon. It was too powerful, its source too distant to target. They could not shield themselves from it. The mountain itself was the medium of its attack. They could not outrun it. Therefore, they had to answer it. They would fight resonance with resonance. They would turn their tomb into a tuning fork. "Sergeant Reyes, report," she commanded, her eyes scanning a dozen cascading data streams at once. She was cross-referencing power core outputs with the real-time geological stress telemetry. "Core is stable, ma'am. Capacitors are at 81% and climbing. We're pulling power from life support and the secondary comms relays." "Life support is a tertiary concern," she replied, without a flicker of emotion. "Continue the charge. I need 100%. Engineering, what is the current resonant frequency of the C-deck pylons?" A voice, strained with effort, came back over the comm. "It's fluctuating, ma'am. It's hitting 23.7 hertz and climbing. The microfractures are propagating. It's like glass." "That is their primary frequency," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. It was elegant, a low, powerful frequency that was perfectly attuned to the crystalline structure of the granite in this specific region. It was not a brute force weapon. It was a key unlocking the mountain's own self-destructive potential. "They've done their homework." She brought up a new window on the main screen, a complex waveform modeling program. "Lieutenant, feed me the geophone data." The raw sound of the mountain filled the command center, a discordant, groaning symphony of a world breaking apart. Aris closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in prayer, but in concentration. She listened, her mind processing the acoustic data with an ability that no machine could replicate. She was hearing the enemy's weapon not as a sound, but as a mathematical equation. She could see its shape, its peaks and troughs, its subtle phase shifts. "They are using a phased array," she said, her eyes snapping open. "At least 3 generators, working in concert to create a focused point of maximum stress, right on top of us." She manipulated the waveform on the screen, her fingers moving with surgical precision. She isolated the enemy frequency, stripped away the background noise of the protesting rock, and created a perfect digital mirror of it. "Reyes, capacitors?" 98%, ma'am." "Almost there," she breathed. She then did something that made the engineers listening gasp. She inverted the waveform. She had created a perfect anti-frequency, an acoustic negative. "This will be our carrier wave," she explained to the silent room. "We are not going to try to cancel their signal. We are going to hijack it." She began to overlay a second frequency on top of the first. This one was her own creation, a complex, jagged thing of precisely calculated harmonics and dissonant overtones. It was, to put it simply, a weaponized sound. "The needle is equipped with a network of seismic dampeners," she explained, her voice as calm as a lecturer in a university hall. "They are designed to absorb tectonic shocks. They are, in essence, powerful subterranean speakers. We are going to reverse their function. We are not going to absorb energy. We are going to project it. We will broadcast our own signal using the enemy's carrier wave. It will travel back along the same path their signal is taking, straight to the generators that are creating it. We will create a feedback loop, a resonant cascade that will destroy their emitters from the inside out." The genius of it was terrifying. The risk was astronomical. "Ma'am," Reyes said, his voice tight, "the power required for that, it would create a seismic event on its own. It could bring the roof down on top of us before it ever reaches the target. "It will," she confirmed, her eyes never leaving the screen. "For approximately 1.7 seconds. That is the window, the time it will take for our pulse to travel and for the feedback loop to overload their systems. We have to survive those 1.7 seconds." The mountain let out a piercing shriek. The crack in the main window splintered, covering the entire pane in a spiderweb of fractures. Red lights flashed on every console. "Structural integrity in the main shaft at 12%, someone yelled. "We're out of time." "Capacitors at 100%, Reyes announced, his knuckles white where he gripped his console. "Now," Eris said. She placed her palm on the central command interface. The screen glowed, recognizing a biometric signature it was not supposed to know. Command override, Ghost, systems slaved. She initiated the sequence. There was no countdown. There was only a moment of absolute heart-stopping silence as all the power in the needle was shunted from every system into the seismic dampener array. The lights went out. The screens went dark. The life-sustaining hum of the facility died. For a fraction of a second, they were adrift in a dead, silent tomb. And then she fired. The world ended. It was not a sound. It was a physical blow. A wave of pure, kinetic force erupted from the foundations of the facility, traveling up through the decks, through the bodies of the crew, through the very air they breathed. It was a physical manifestation of a god's fury. The entire structure of the needle was thrown upwards, then slammed back down. Concrete dust exploded from the walls. Consoles were ripped from their moorings. People were thrown from their feet. It was the single most violent 1.7 seconds any of them had ever experienced. It was the feeling of being inside a planet-sized bell, struck by a hammer forged in the heart of a star. Eris remained in her chair, strapped in, her body rigid against the impossible G-forces. She watched a single chronometer on her wrist, the only thing in the room with power. 1.5, 1.6, 1.7, and then silence. Not the dead silence of before. This was a new silence, a profound, echoing quiet that was defined by the absence of the groaning mountain, the absence of the enemy's hum. The emergency lights flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows across a scene of utter devastation. The command center was a wreck, but it was a silent wreck. The shaking had stopped. A low groan came from across the room. Sergeant Reyes pulled himself up, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. He looked at Aris, his eyes wide with a terror that was rapidly being replaced by a profound, reverent awe. "Ma'am," he whispered into the quiet. "Status?" Aris took a slow, measured breath. She ran a diagnostic on the external sensors, the program running on a hardened, independent power source. A simple graph appeared on her wrist-mounted display. It showed the enemy's resonant frequency, a massive screaming spike for the last several hours, and then, at a single point in time, it dropped to 0. It didn't fade, it didn't weaken, it vanished, as if it had never been. The threat was neutralized. "The feedback loop was successful," she announced to the groaning, stirring survivors in the wreckage. "Their emitters have been destroyed." She paused, then added, "The mountain is stable." A ragged cheer went up from the crew. It was a weak, exhausted sound, but it was a sound of victory, of survival against impossible odds. In the middle of it all, Eris Thorne sat in her command chair, the architect of their salvation, her expression as calm and unreadable as ever. Her solution, a checkmate delivered across miles of solid rock, had triumphed where brute force and blind protocol had failed. The silence that followed was the sound of her victory. In the quiet aftermath, as the crew began to tend to the wounded and assess the catastrophic damage, a single console flickered to life. It was a high-priority communications channel, one that used a quantum entanglement relay that was, by its very nature, immune to the electromagnetic chaos that had crippled their other systems. It was a channel that, officially, did not exist on this station. A single encrypted icon appeared on the screen. Reyes, his face smudged with dust and grime, looked at it in confusion. "Ma'am, I've never seen that comm protocol before. It's a Fleet Admiral's channel." Eris nodded. "Put it on." Reyes patched the signal through. A voice, calm, authoritative, and utterly confident, filled the ruined command center. It was a voice accustomed to commanding fleets and moving armies. "Ghost, this is Trident. Acknowledge." The crew froze. They looked at Aris. Ghost. The name hung in the air, freighted with meaning. Eris leaned forward slightly. "Trident, this is Ghost. I read you." The voice on the other end didn't miss a beat. "Report, Ghost. We registered a significant seismic event originating from your location, followed by a total loss of enemy resonant emissions. What is your status?" "The facility is compromised but stable," Eris reported, her tone as flat and factual as if she were reading a weather report. "Threat neutralized. Personnel sustained minor injuries, but no fatalities. The station's security commander, Major Coulson, has been relieved of duty and is confined, pending your instructions." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Understood. His incompetence has been noted at this end for some time. Command of DLP-7 is officially transferred to you, effective immediately. A search and rescue team is being mobilized, but your exfiltration will be handled by a separate, dedicated asset. Is your primary mission objective complete?" "Affirmative, Trident," Aris said. "Their weapon has been identified, analyzed, and the means to counter it have been proven effective. The data is secure." "Excellent work, Ghost. Trident out." The channel closed. The icon vanished. A new, deeper silence fell over the command center. The crew stared at Eris Thorne, the civilian analyst, the quiet woman from the corner. They were not just looking at their savior. They were looking at something else entirely. A legend they had only heard whispered about. The Ghost. A name given to a shadowy operator who moved between the worlds of intelligence, science, and special operations. A figure who solved problems that had no other solution. At that moment, the door to the command center was forced open. Two Marines, their faces grim, half carried, half dragged Major Coulson into the room. His uniform was disheveled. His face was a mask of pale, humiliated fury. His right arm was in a makeshift sling. He saw Eris in the command chair, saw the looks of awe and respect on the faces of the crew, and the last vestiges of his authority crumbled into dust. "What is this?" he roared, his voice thin and reedy. "This is my command. I am in charge here." Sergeant Reyes stepped forward. He was no longer the quiet communications tech. There was a new hardness in his eyes. "You were relieved of command, sir, by Fleet Admiral Jacobs." Coulson stared at him, then at Eris. "You," he whispered, the single word dripping with a venom that couldn't hide his terror. "What are you?" Eris looked at him. For the first time, there was something other than detached analysis in her eyes. It was not pity. It was a cold, clinical finality. She did not answer his question. She did not need to. The answer was all around him, in the silent mountain, in the loyal crew, in the voice of the admiral that still echoed in the ruins of his command. His fall from power was absolute, a public and undeniable consequence of his own arrogance. He had challenged a force he could not comprehend, and it had broken him without effort. "Escort the major to his quarters," she ordered, her voice quiet but carrying the unquestionable weight of command. "Ensure he receives medical attention." The two Marines, who had once been his loyal enforcers, looked at her, then at Coulson, and their choice was clear. They nodded and guided the sputtering, defeated major out of the room, his disgrace now complete. A new order settled over the Needle. It was quiet, efficient, and competent. Under Eris's direction, the crew began the painstaking process of bringing critical systems back online. There was no shouting, no panic, just calm, precise instructions and immediate, unquestioning execution. They worked with a unity of purpose they had never known under Coulson's blustering command. Eris moved among them, a quiet presence offering technical guidance on rerouting a power conduit or suggesting a more efficient way to patch a communications link. She showed no pride in her victory, no pleasure in her newfound authority. She was simply a professional, completing her mission. Sergeant Reyes approached her as she stood before the cracked observation window, looking out into the darkness of the main shaft. He held out a steaming mug. "Coffee, ma'am." She took it, her fingers briefly brushing his. "Thank you, Sergeant." He hesitated for a moment. The question he wanted to ask, the one everyone wanted to ask, caught in his throat. "Who are you?" Instead, he found a different question. "The waveform you created. The counter-resonance. I've never seen anything like it. The math was impossible." Eris took a sip of the coffee. She looked at the complex pattern of fractures on the plexiglass. "Nothing is impossible," she said, her voice distant. "There are only incorrect assumptions and a failure to see the whole problem. The major's assumption was that the threat was human. The real threat was physics. I simply answered in the language the problem understood." It was the closest she would ever come to explaining herself. It was enough. Reyes nodded, the quiet acknowledgement of a student before a master, and returned to his station. The cultural shift was complete. Merit had replaced rank. Competence had silenced ego. Hours later, the dedicated asset arrived. It was not a bustling rescue team with stretchers and emergency gear. It was two quiet men in sterile black fatigues who emerged from a service elevator that no one knew existed. They moved with the same silent efficiency as Eris. They spoke to no one, their eyes scanning the room before settling on her. They nodded once. It was time to go. Her purpose fulfilled, Eris Thorne prepared to depart as quietly as she had arrived. She handed a data chip to Sergeant Reyes. "This contains the full after-action report and a systems diagnostic. Give it to the official recovery team, no one else." "Yes, ma'am," he said, taking the chip as if it were a holy relic. Will we see you again?" She looked at him, and for a fleeting instant, something like warmth flickered in her cold, analytical eyes. "The mission is to ensure people like you never have to." With that, she turned and walked towards the two men. The three of them disappeared into the service elevator, and the doors slid shut without a sound. She was gone. The ghost had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a stable mountain, a saved crew, and a story that would be told in hushed, reverent tones for years. The legend of what happened in the Needle became a foundational myth for a new generation of soldiers and intelligence operatives. It was a story about the failure of arrogance and the triumph of intellect, It served as a stark reminder that the most dangerous threats are often the ones you cannot see, and the most effective weapon is a mind that can see the whole problem. Eris Thorne, or whatever her real name was never officially acknowledged. There was no medal, no public commendation. Her victory was her anonymity, her reward the continuation of her work in the shadows. She remained a ghost, a silent guardian moving through the unseen cracks of the world. A quiet professional defined not by the rank on her collar, but by the perfect chilling clarity of her solutions, forever answering the world's most complex problems in the only language that mattered.